The University Cultural Center officially opened on 5th September 2000, and it has been the venue for several of Prime Minister's National Day rallies, a key event in the political calendar where the Prime Minister addresses the nation. Located on the picturesque landscapes of Kent Ridge, the University Cultural Center serves as a vibrant, innovative performing arts venue for high-quality events.
The line of honor along the final stretch of the procession, mounted by 48 military policemen from the Singapore Armed Forces Military Police Command, led by Lieutenant Colonel Mark Tan, who heads the Plans Branch at Headquarters 2nd People's Defence Forces. As the procession passes through, the military policemen inverted their rifles and bowed their heads as a mark of respect.
Known as resting on arms reversed, it signifies the paying of the highest respect to Mr. Lee. "16 pallbearers receiving Mr. Lee at the University Cultural Center. They include cabinet colleagues, Deputy Prime Minister Tharman Shanmugaratnam, Mr. Lim Swee Say, NTUC Secretary General and Minister in the Prime Minister's Office. Other pallbearers include members of the Labour movement, Mr. John De Peva, the longest-serving president of the National Trades Union Congress, the umbrella body for trade unions in Singapore.
Another veteran unionist, Ms. Diana Chia, current president of the NTUC. Others who served Singapore in different capacities and represented how Mr. Lee has helped to build a safe, secure, and harmonious Singapore include Ambassador-at-Large Chan Ing-chi, who was Singapore's longest-serving ambassador to the United States.
Retired Staff Sergeant Mr. Kang Lai Teck, Samuel Lee, Mr. Gurmit Singh, President of the Interreligious Organization.
Other pallbearers include Mr. Pok Xiong Fu, who contributed to the building of the first MRT lines in the 70s and 80s.
Chairman of the National Water Agency, or PUB, Mr. Tan Gi Pao.
From Education, Mr. Wong Siu Hung, who will be the Director General of Education. The grandsons of the late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew holding the photo of Mr. Lee. All the grandchildren standing together. The coffin bearer party now moving into position for the final stage of the state funeral procession.
The officers who form the coffin bearer party have removed their ceremonial caps, and they are led by Brigadier General Ong Zi Chin, Commander, 3rd Division. Preparing to transfer the coffin from the gun carriage They will then proceed to shoulder the casket into the University Cultural Center.
Lower.
Also among the pallbearers, Miss Kuratu Ain Binte Amin Nurashid, who has received a Lee Kuan Yew scholarship to encourage upgrading. Miss Lim Hui Ling, a nurse at the Singapore General Hospital. Miss Dorothy Han from Keppel Fells, one of Singapore's largest companies which builds mobile offshore rigs. Miss Anne Marie Leong, a stewardess with Singapore Airlines. And representing Mr. Lee's achievements in greening Singapore, Mr. Wong Thuan Wah, Director for Conservation at NParks, who oversees Mr. Lee's beloved Istana Gardens. From Education, Mr. Wong Siu Hung, who will be the Director General of Education and was once Headmaster of Raffles Institution.
Combined band from the Singapore Armed Forces and the Singapore Police Force performing George Frederick Handel's The Dead March from Seoul. Inside the University Cultural Center, leaders from more than 20 countries, alongside family members and invited guests. members of the media and inter-religious organization in attendance.
As the coffin bearer party slowly makes its way into the hall of the University Cultural Center, Samuel Barber's Adagio is being played. World leaders in attendance waiting for the service to start. In just a short while, 10 eulogies will be read. The first will be by Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong,
followed by President Dr. Tony Tan and Emeritus Senior Minister Chok Tong.
Old Guard colleague of Mr. Lee, Ong Pang Boon, former Cabinet Minister S. Dhanabalan,
former Senior Minister of State Sidek Saniff, Unionists G. Muthukuramasamy,
Tanjung Pagar community leader Leong Chun Lun, former journalist Cassandra Chu,
and finally Mr. Lee Hsien Yang, younger son of Mr. Lee.
The Master of Ceremony to lead the state funeral is Singapore's head of the civil service, Mr. Peter Ong, who has been head since 2010. The Singapore Symphony Orchestra playing this very moving rendition of Samuel Barber's Adagio. The mood is pensive and somber as all who have gathered at the University Cultural Center are waiting for the service to begin. Amongst those who have gathered, world leaders, former cabinet colleagues, members of parliament, specially invited guests, and students.
MPs past and present, and cabinet ministers gathered here at the University Cultural Center. State wreaths will be laid. The first state wreath will be presented by Prime Minister Lee Hsien. The second wreath by President Dr. Tony Tan.
After the 10 eulogies have been read, the lone bugler from the SAF military band will sound the last post, marking the end of the day's labor and the start of the night's rest. It represents a final salute to Mr. Lee Kuan Yew.
The public warning system siren will sound for 15 seconds to rally all in Singapore to observe a minute of silence, and sound again after the minute of silence. Following that, the rouse will be sounded, a call back to duty after respect has been paid to the memory of Mr. Lee. Singaporeans across the island will recite the national pledge and sing the national anthem.
As the coffin bearer party enters the hall at a slow pace, later on it will be accompanied by J.S. Bach's Air from Orchestral Suite No. 3 in D major, performed by the Singapore Symphony Orchestra.
Leaders from more than 20 countries, alongside family members and invited guests. From the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, Brunei Sultan Hassan al-Bolkiah, Indonesia President Joko Widodo, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and flags in India and New Zealand will also today fly at half-mast. Former US President Bill Clinton, Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott, Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Sen.
Ladies and gentlemen, please rise. Please be seated.
Family of the late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, Mr. President, Prime Minister, Majesties, Presidents, Governor Generals, Prime Ministers and honored guests, Singaporeans who are in this hall, and Singaporeans who are watching this from all over Singapore and from overseas. We are gathered here this afternoon to pay our last respects to the late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, who left us on 23rd March 2015. The Prime Minister will now deliver his eulogy.
President Tony Tan, friends, family, and fellow Singaporeans. This has been a dark week for Singapore. The light that has guided us all these years has been extinguished. We've lost our founding father, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, who lived and breathed Singapore all his life. He and his team led our pioneer generation to create this island nation, Singapore. Mr. Lee did not set out to be a politician, let alone a statesman as a boy. In fact, his grandfather wanted him to become an English gentleman, but events left an indelible mark on him. He'd been a British subject in colonial Singapore. He'd survived hardship, danger, and fear in the Japanese occupation. These life experiences drove him to fight for independence. In one of his radio talks on the Battle of Merger, many years ago in 1961, Mr. Lee said, "My colleagues and I are of that generation of young men who went through the Second World War and the Japanese occupation and emerged determined that no one, neither the Japanese nor the British, had the right to push and kick us around." Mr. Lee championed independence for Singapore through merger with Malaya to form a new federation, the Federation of Malaysia. He worked tirelessly to bring this about and succeeded. Unfortunately, the merger did not last, and before long, we were expelled from Malaysia. Separation was his greatest moment of anguish, but it also proved to be the turning point in Singapore's fortunes. From the ashes of separation, he built a nation. The easiest thing to do would have been to appeal to Chinese voters alone. After all, Singapore had had to leave Malaysia because we were majority Chinese. Instead, Mr. Lee went for the nobler dream of a multiracial, multi-religious nation. Singapore would not be based on race, language, or religion, but on fundamental values: multiracialism, equality, meritocracy, integrity, and rule of law. Mr. Lee declared this is not a country that belongs to any single community. It belongs to all of us. He checked would-be racial chauvinists and assured the minorities that their place here was secure. He insisted on keeping our mother tongues, even as English became our common working language. He encouraged each group to maintain its culture, faith, and language while gradually enlarging the common space shared by all. Together with Mr. S. Rajaratnam, he enshrined these ideals in the National Pledge. He kept us safe in a dangerous and tumultuous world. With Dr. Goh Keng Swee, he built the SAF from just 2 infantry battalions and 1 little wooden ship into a well-trained, well-equipped, well-respected fighting force. He introduced national service and personally persuaded parents to entrust their sons to the SAF. He succeeded, first, because he led by example. His 2 sons did NS, just like every Singaporean son. In fact, my brother and I signed up as regulars in the SAF, Tan Jiak Ping. And we went in on SAF scholarships. Secondly, people trusted Mr. Lee, and they believe in the Singapore cause. And therefore, today, we sleep peacefully at night, confident that we are well protected. Mr. Lee gave us courage to face an uncertain future. He was a straight talker, and he never shied away from hard truths, either to himself or to Singaporeans. His ministers would sometimes urge him to soften the tone of his draft speeches. Even I would sometimes do that, to sound less unyielding to human frailties. And often he took in their amendments, but he would preserve his core message. As he said, I always tried to be correct, not politically correct. He was a powerful speaker, moving, inspiring, persuasive in English and Malay, and by dint of a lifelong hard slog in Mandarin and even Hokkien. MediaCorp has been broadcasting his old speeches on TV this week, reminding us that his was the original Singapore roar, passionate, formidable, and indomitable. Above all, Lee Kuan Yew was a fighter. In crisis, when all seemed hopeless, he was ferocious, endlessly resourceful, firm in his resolve, and steadfast in advancing his cause. And thus he saw us through many battles. The battle for merger against the communists, which most people thought the non-communists would lose. The fight when we were in Malaysia against the communalists when his own life was in danger. Separation, which cast us out into a hazardous world. And then the withdrawal of the British military forces from Singapore, which threatened the livelihoods of 150,000 people. Because he never wavered, we didn't falter. Because he fought, we took courage and fought with him and prevailed. And thus, Mr. Lee took Singapore and took us all from the third world to the first. In many countries, anti-colonial fighters and heroes would win independence and assume power, but then fail at nation building. Because the challenges of bringing a society together, growing an economy, patiently improving people's lives are very different from the challenges of fighting for independence, mobilizing crowds, getting people excited, overthrowing a regime. But Mr. Lee and his team succeeded at nation building. Just weeks after separation, Mr. Lee boldly declared that 10 years from now, this will be a metropolis. Never fear. And indeed, he made it happen. He instilled discipline and order, ensuring that in Singapore, every problem gets fixed. He educated our young. He transformed labor relations from strikes and confrontation to tripartism and cooperation. He campaigned to upgrade skills and to raise productivity, calling this effort a marathon with no finish line. He enabled his economic team, Goh Keng Swee, Hon Swee Sen, Lim Kim San, to design and carry out plans to attract investments, grow the economy, and create prosperity and jobs. As he said, I settled the political conditions so that tough policies could be executed. However, Mr. Lee was also clear that while the development of the economy is very important, equally important is the development of the nature of our society. So he built an inclusive society where everyone enjoyed the fruits of progress. Education became the foundation for good jobs and better lives. HDB new towns sprung up, one after another. Queenstown, Tua Payoh, Ang Mo Kio, to be followed by many more. We had roofs over our heads, and we became a nation of homeowners. With Mr. Devan Nair in the NTUC, he transformed the union movement into a positive force, cooperating with employers and with the government to improve the lot of workers. Mr. Lee cared for the people whom he served, the people of Singapore. When SARS struck in 2003, he worried about taxi drivers whose livelihoods were affected because tourists had dried up, and he pressed us hard for ways to find ways to help the taxi drivers. Mr. Lee also cared for the people who served him. One evening, just a few years ago, he rang me up. One of my mother's WSOs, women security officers, was having difficulty conceiving a child, and he wanted to help her. And he asked me whether I knew how to help her to adopt a child. So Mr. Lee was concerned for people not just in the abstract, but personally and individually. Internationally, Mr. Lee raised Singapore's standing in the world. He wasn't just a perceptive observer of world affairs, but a statesman who articulated Singapore's international interests and enlarged our strategic space. At crucial turning points, from the British withdrawal east of Suez to the Vietnam War to the rise of China, his views and counsel influenced thinking and decisions in many capitals. In the process, he built up a wide network of friends in and out of power. He knew every Chinese leader from Mao Zedong and every US president from Lyndon Johnson. He established close rapport with President Suharto of Indonesia, one of our most important relationships. Others he knew included Deng Xiaoping, Margaret Thatcher, Helmut Schmidt, George Shultz, as well as President Bill Clinton and Henry Kissinger, who we are honored to have here with us this afternoon. They all valued his candor and his insight. As Mrs. Thatcher said, Mr. Lee had a way of penetrating the fog of propaganda and expressing with unique clarity the issues of our time and the way to tackle them. He was never wrong. And hence, despite being small, Singapore's voice is heard, and we enjoy far more influence on the world stage than we have any reason to expect. Mr. Lee didn't blaze this path alone. He was the outstanding leader of an exceptional team, a team which included Goh Keng Swee, S. Rajaratnam, Osman Wok, Hon Swee Sen, Lim Kim San, Toh Chin Chai, Ong Pang Boon, Devan Nair, and quite a number more. They were his comrades, and he never forgot them. So it's very good that Mr. Ong Pang Boon is here today with us to speak about Mr. Lee later on. Thank you, Mr. Ong. Mr. Lee received many accolades and awards in his long life, but he wore them lightly. When he received the Freedom of the City of London in 1982, he said, "I feel like a conductor at a concert, bowing to applause, but unable to turn around and invite the accomplished musicians in his orchestra to rise and receive the ovation for the music they have played." For running a government is not unlike running an orchestra, and no prime minister ever achieves much without an able team of players. Because he worked with a strong team and not alone, because people knew that he cared for them and not for himself, and because he had faith that Singaporeans would work with him to achieve great things, Mr. Lee won the trust and confidence of Singaporeans. The pioneer generation who had lived through the crucial years had a deep bond with him. I once met a lady who owned a successful fried rice restaurant. She told me, "Tell Mr. Lee Kuan Yew I will always support him. I was born in 1948 and I'm 48 years old." The year was 1996. There was some issue then, and this question had come up. "I know what he has done for me and Singapore." She and her generation knew that, to use a Chinese phrase, 跟着李光耀走，不会死的. If you follow Lee Kuan Yew, you will survive. Mr. Lee imbued Singapore with his personal traits. He built Singapore to be clean and corruption-free. His home was Spartan, his habits were frugal. He wore the same jackets for years and patched up the worn bits instead of buying new ones. He imparted these values to the government. And even when old and frail, on his 90th birthday, when he came to Parliament and MPs celebrated his birthday in Parliament, he reminded them that Singapore must remain clean and incorruptible, and that MPs and ministers had to set the example. He pursued his ideas with tremendous and infectious energy. He said of himself, "I put myself down as determined, consistent, persistent. I set out to do something, I keep on chasing it until it succeeds. That's all." Easy to say, very few do it. And this was how he seized opportunities, seeing and realizing possibilities that many others missed. So it was he who pushed to move Paya Lebar Airport to Changi. It was he who rejected the then conventional wisdom that MNCs were rapacious and exploitative, and he wooed foreign investments from MNCs personally to bring us advanced technology, to bring us overseas markets, to create for us good jobs. He wasn't afraid to change his mind when a policy was no longer relevant. When he saw that our birth rates were falling below replacement, more than 30 years ago, he scrapped the stop at 2 policy and started encouraging couples to have more children. Having upheld a very conservative approach to supervising our financial sector for many years, he eventually decided the time had come to rethink and liberalize, but to do so in a controlled way. And this was how Singapore's financial center took off in a new wave of growth to become what it is today. He was always clear what strategy to follow, but never so fixed to an old strategy as to be blind to the need to change course when the world changed. Nothing exemplifies this better than water security, which was a lifelong obsession of his. He entrenched the PUB's 2 water agreements with Johor in the separation agreement. He personally managed all aspects of our water talks with Malaysia. He launched water-saving campaigns. He built reservoirs. He turned most of the island into water catchment to collect the rain, to process, to use. He cleaned up the Singapore River and Kallang Basin. He dreamed of the Marina Barrage long before it became feasible and persevered for decades until finally technology caught up and it became feasible and it became a reality. And he lived to see it become a reality. When PUB invented new water and desalination became viable, he backed these new technologies enthusiastically. So the result today is Singapore has moved towards self-sufficiency in water, become a leader in water technologies, and turn a vulnerability into strength. So perhaps it's appropriate that today, for his state funeral, the heavens opened and cried for him. Greening Singapore was another of his passions. On travels, when he came across trees or plants that might grow well here, he'd collect saplings and seeds and hand-carry them back home. He used the Istana grounds as a nursery and would personally check on the health of the trees, not just in general, but individual, particular trees. If they had names, he would know their names. He knew the names of the scientific names. Singapore's Prime Minister was also the chief gardener of the city in a garden. He had a relentless drive to improve and continued to learn well into old age. At 70, to write his memoirs, he started learning how to use his computer. Every so often, he would call me for help, sometimes late at night, and I would give him a phone consultation and talk him through the steps, how to save a file, how to find a document which has vanished somewhere on his hard drive. And if he couldn't find me, he would consult my wife. He made a ceaseless effort to learn Mandarin over decades. He listened to tapes of his teacher talking, conversing with him every day, in the morning while shaving at home, in the evening while exercising at Sri Temasek. And he kept up his Mandarin classes all his life. Indeed, his last appointment on the 4th of February this year, before he was taken gravely ill early the next morning, was with his Mandarin tutor. He inspired all of us to give of our best. And he was constantly thinking about Singapore. At one National Day rally in 1988, he declared, "Even from my sickbed, even if you are going to lower me into the grave and I feel something is going wrong, I will get up." And he meant that. Indeed, even after he left the cabinet, occasionally he would still raise with me issues which he felt strongly about. During the budget debate 2 years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago, MPs hotly debated the cost of living, public transport, and so many other matters then preoccupying Singaporeans. Mr. Lee felt we had lost sight of the fundamentals that underpinned our survival. He emailed me. He sent me a draft speech. He told me he wanted to speak in the chamber to remind Singaporeans of these unchanging, hard truths, what our survival depended upon. But I persuaded him to leave the task to me and my ministers, and he took my advice. But his biggest worry was that younger Singaporeans would lose the instinct for what made Singapore tick. And this was why he continued writing books into his 90s. Bilingualism, hard truths, one man's view of the world, and at least one more guided by him, still in the process of being written, on the history of the PAP. Why did he do this? So that the new generation of Singaporeans could learn from his experience and understand what their security, prosperity, and future depended upon. One of Mr. Lee's greatest legacies was preparing Singapore to continue beyond him. He believed that the leader's toughest job was ensuring succession. So he systematically identified and groomed a team of successors. He made way for Mr. Goh Chok Tong to become Prime Minister after him, but stayed on in Mr. Goh's cabinet to help the new team succeed. He provided stability and experience and quietly helped to build up Mr. Goh's authority. He knew how to guide without being obtrusive, to be watchful while letting the new team develop its own style, its own authority. He described himself like a mascot, but everyone knew how special this mascot was and how lucky we were to have such a mascot. And it was likewise when I took over. Mr. Goh became Senior Minister, Mr. Lee became Minister Mentor, a title which he felt reflected his new role. Not in command, but advice not to be taken lightly. Increasingly, he left policy issues to us, but he would share with us his reading of world affairs and his advice on major problems which he saw over the horizon. Some other prime ministers told me that they couldn't imagine what it was like to have two former PMs in my cabinet. But I told them it worked, both for me and for Singapore. For all his public duties, Mr. Lee also had his own family. My mother was a big part of his life. They were a deeply loving couple. She was his loyal spouse and confidant, going with him everywhere, fussing over him, helping with his speeches, and keeping home and hearth warm. They were a perfect team and wonderful parents. When my mother died, he was bereft. He felt the devastating loss of a lifetime partner, who, as he said, had helped him to become what he was. My father left the upbringing of the children largely to my mother, but he was the head of the family and he cared deeply about us, both when we were small and long after we had grown up. He wasn't very demonstrative, much less was he touchy-feely. So not new age, but he loved us deeply. After my first wife, Ming Yang, died, my parents suggested that I try meditation. They gave me some books to read, mindfulness, tranquility meditation. I read the books, but I didn't make much progress. I think my father had tried meditation too, also not too successfully. His teacher told me later that when he told Mr. Lee to relax, still his mind and let go, he replied, "But what will happen to Singapore if I let go?" When I had lymphoma, he suggested that I try meditation more seriously. He thought it would help me to fight the cancer. He found me a teacher, spoke to him personally, and with a good teacher to guide me, I made better progress. In his old age, after my mother died, my father started meditating again, and this time with help from Kok Song, whom he knew from GIC. Kok Song brought a friend to see my father. The friend was a Benedictine monk who did Christian meditation. My father was not a Christian, but he was happy to learn from a Benedictine monk. And he even called me to suggest that I meet the monk, which I did. He probably felt I needed to resume meditation too. And to give you some context, this was a few months after the 2011 general election. I was by then nearly 60, and he was by then nearly 90. But to him, I was still his son to be worried over, and to me, he was still a father to love and appreciate, just like when I was small. So this morning, before the ceremonies began at Parliament House, we had a few minutes. I sat by him and meditated. Of course, growing up as my father's son could not but mean being exposed to politics very early. I remember as a little boy, I knew his constituency was Tanjong Pagar. I was proud of him becoming legal advisor to so many trade unions, and I was excited by the hubbub at Oxley Road whenever elections happened and our home became the election office. I remember when we were preparing to join Malaysia in the early 60s, going along with my father on constituency visits, the Fang Wen tours, which he made to every corner of Singapore. For him, it was back-breaking work, week after week, every weekend, rallying the people's support for a supremely important decision about Singapore's future. For me, these were not just Sunday outings, but also an early political education. I remember election night in 1963, the crucial general election when the PAP defeated the pro-communist Barisan Sosialis. My mother sent me to bed early, but I lay awake in bed to listen to the election results until the PAP had won enough seats to form the government again. And then I think I fell asleep. I remember the day he told me, while we were playing golf at the Istana, that should anything happen to him, he wanted me to look after my mother and my younger brother and sister. I remember the night the children slept on the floor in my parents' bedroom at Temasek House in Kuala Lumpur. Because the house was full of ministers who had come up from Singapore. And every so often, my father would get up from bed to make a note about something before lying down to rest again. But obviously, he wasn't asleep. And the date was 7th of August, 1965, 2 days before separation. Growing up with my father, living through those years with him, made me what I am. This year is the 50th anniversary of Singapore's independence. We all wanted Mr. Lee to be present with us on August the 9th to celebrate this milestone. More than anybody else, it was he who fought for multiracialism, which ultimately led to our independence as a sovereign republic. It was he who united our nation, built a nation, and made our 50th anniversary worth celebrating. Sadly, it is not to be. But we can feel proud and happy that Mr. Lee lived to see his life's work come to fruition. At last year's National Day Parade, when Mr. Lee appeared and waved, and it appeared on the big screen on the floating platform, the crowd gave him the most deafening cheer of the whole parade. Last November, the People's Action Party celebrated its diamond anniversary at the Victoria Concert Hall, where Mr. Lee founded the party 60 years ago. Party members were so happy to see that Mr. Lee could be there. They gave him a rousing, emotional, standing ovation. Those of us who were there will never forget it. St. Paul's Cathedral in London was built by Sir Christopher Wren, a famous architect. He was the architect of the cathedral, and he's buried in the cathedral, which was his masterpiece. There's a Latin epitaph on his grave, and it reads, Si monumentum requiris circumspice. It means, if you seek his monument, look around you. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew built Singapore. To those who seek Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's monument, Singaporeans can reply proudly, look around you. Now let me continue in Malay and then Mandarin. Saudara-saudari,
Fellow
setanah air.
Singaporeans,
Kita kehilangan
we
seorang
have
tokoh
lost a
yang
leader
telah memimpin
who
kita,
had guided us,
menjadi sumber
inspired
inspirasi
us,
kita, menyatupadukan kita,
united
dan
us,
merintis kejayaan.
and laid the foundation for our
Ini
success.
termasuk keharmonian kaum yang kita
This includes
nikmati
the
selama
racial
ini.
harmony that we have been
Ia
enjoying
adalah
all
hasil
this while.
komitmen mendalam
It is the
Encik Lee
result of Mr.
untuk
Lee's deep
memperkukuh
commitment
hubungan antara
to
kaum
strengthen
dan
interracial
agama yang berbeza-beza
and
di
interreligious
Singapura.
ties among the different
Satu
races
visi
and
yang
religions in
turut
Singapore,
didukung kuat
a
masyarakat
vision that
Malay.
is also strongly supported by the
Encik
Malays.
Lee amat menghargai sokongan
Mr.
padu
Lee
masyarakat
deeply
Melayu
appreciated
kepada visi
the
beliau
solid support
dan
of the
kepada
Malays for
pada
his
tindakan
vision
rakyat itu,
and the PAP,
khususnya ketika Singapura
especially when
menjadi
Singapore
sebahagian
was still
dari Malaysia dahulu.
part of Malaysia.
Tanpa sokongan masyarakat
Without the
Melayu
support
ketika
of the
itu,
Malays then,
kemungkinan besar
it is
Singapura
highly
hari ini
likely
amat
that Singapore
berbeza.
today would have turned out differently.
Oleh itu, apabila
So,
Singapura
when
merdeka,
Singapore
Encik
gained
Lee berazam
independence,
untuk memastikan
Mr. Lee was determined
bahawa kaum
to
minoriti
ensure
ada tempat
that the
di
minorities
Singapura
have their place
untuk
in Singapore
selama-lamanya.
forever.
Iltizamnya untuk
His
membantu
commitment
masyarakat
in
Melayu
helping the
Islam
Malay Muslim
berkembang
community
maju
to progress
amat ketara.
was apparent.
Beliau telah mengasaskan
He laid the
pembentukan
foundation
dana
for the
pembangunan
formation
masjid
of the
supaya
mosque building
masyarakat
fund
Melayu Islam dapat
so that
membina
the
masjid di
community
setiap
could build
estate
mosques
perumahan
in every housing
melalui
estate
sumbangan bulanan
through
setiap
contributions
pekerja
from
Islam.
every working Muslim.
Encik Lee juga percaya
Mr. Lee
bahawa
also believed
pendidikan
that
merupakan
education
kunci
is the main
utama
key
untuk
to
meningkatkan
uplift
masyarakat Melayu.
the Malay community.
Dan oleh itu,
For
beliau
this
telah
reason,
menyokong kuat
he strongly
pembentukan
supported
Yayasan
the
Mendaki
setting up of the
demi
Mendaki
membantu
Foundation
pelajar dan
to help
keluarga
needy
Melayu yang
Malay
susah.
students and families.
Dalam kita berduka dengan
While we
kepergian
are saddened
Encik Lee,
by Mr.
ayo
Lee's
kita
departure,
menjunjung dan
let us
merayakan
honor
semangat
and
serta
celebrate
sumbangan beliau.
his spirit and
Marilah
contributions.
kita teruskan usaha
Let us
untuk
continue
membangunkan
efforts
Singapura,
to develop Singapore,
memperkukuh masyarakat
strengthen
berbilang
our
bangsa dan agama
multiracial
kita,
and multi-religious
serta
society,
berganding bahu
and work
sebagai
together
satu bangsa
as one
Singapura,
united people,
seperti apa yang Encik Lee
just as
perjuangkan
Mr. Lee
sepanjang hayat.
fought for all his life.
Now in Mandarin. 新加坡的发展和成功
Singapore's
跟建国总理
development and
李光耀
success
先生的
were
个性和理想 有着密不可分的关系。
inextricably linked to Mr.
如果
Lee's
当年
personality and
建国
ideals.
总理和他的同僚
If
做了
Mr.
不同
Lee
的
and
抉择
his colleagues had chosen a
对争
different
取和
path
捍卫新加
or
坡的
did
独立
not
自
have
主
the
没有远
vision
大的
and
抱负和坚
determination
持
to fight
肯
for
定
and
没有
defend
今天的
Singapore's
新加坡。
independence, Singapore would definitely
建
not
国
be
总
what
理
it
不
is
惜付
today.
出他的一切，为
Mr.
实
Lee
现
gave
建
his
设
all
新加坡
and
的
worked
理想
hard to
而
build
努力奋
Singapore.
斗。李光耀
His
先生的
motto
人
was,
生格言是：新加
"For
坡要取得
Singapore to
要继
continue
续
to
取得
thrive,
成功，人民
we
就必
must
须
always
时
be
刻
vigilant
居安思
and
危，
never rest on
绝
our
对不
laurels.
能安于现状。我们应该用
We
智
have
慧、
to apply
创意和毅
wisdom
力，
and
不断地改
creativity
造新加坡，
and keep
让这个小岛国
persevering
能
to
够维护自己
continually
的利益，
remake
并且
Singapore.
在世界舞台上
Then this
有一
island
席之地
state can safeguard
受
its
到国际的
interests,
肯定。
be relevant to the world, and be recognized
李光耀
internationally.
先生为国为民，
Mr. Lee devoted his whole life to serving the nation and realized his lifelong aspiration to build a rugged society and a vibrant
一
nation.
个活力四射的国家。李先生
In his twilight years,
晚年
he was heartened to see Singapore's continued stability, prosperity, and growth, even after he had stepped down.
更好的未来。李光耀先生
A humble
充分
and
展
keen
现
learner,
不耻下问，
Mr.
活到老
Lee was
学
a
到
model
老的
of
精神
lifelong learning.
在最后一次入
In
院的前
fact,
夕，
he
他
was
还在上
attending his
华语课
regular Mandarin lesson on the very night before he was last admitted to
他
hospital.
有一段
Mr.
很
Lee
美
was
满的
blessed
婚
with a happy family and a
和已故的
loving
夫人
marriage.
可以尊
He
女
and
士
the
就
late
说得
Madam
好
Kwa Geok Chu were a
相
loving
知
couple.
相惜夫妻情深。他的三个孩子
His
在
three
不同的领
children
域
have
事业有
successful
成
careers and are contributing to
为社会服务。
society.
李光耀先生
In
在
his
晚年
later years,
子孙
he
满
was
堂
fortunate
安
to
享
enjoy his
天伦之乐
grandchildren's company.
如今
While we grieve for the loss of our founding Prime Minister, we are also deeply grateful that he had led Singapore on its remarkable journey, which has now entered its 50th year. As we remember him, let us not forget his vision for Singapore, his love for this country. Let us carry on his perseverance and dedication to continue the Singapore miracle, so that Mr. Lee will not have to worry about his future. May he rest in peace.
I said, the light that has guided us all these years has been extinguished. But that's not quite so. For Mr. Lee's principles and ideals continue to invigorate this government and to guide our people. His life will inspire Singaporeans and others for generations to come. Mr. Lee once said that we intend to see that Singapore will be here 1,000 years from now, and that's your duty and mine. Mr. Lee has done his duty and more. It remains our duty to continue his life's work, to carry the torch forward and keep the flame burning bright. Over the past month, the outpouring of good wishes, prayers, and support from Singaporeans as Mr. Lee lay ill has been overwhelming, and even more so since he passed away on Monday. People of all races, from all walks of life, young and old, here and abroad, have mourned him. Hundreds of thousands queued patiently for hours in the hot sun and through the night to pay respects to him at the Parliament House. I visited the queue on the Padang. Many Singaporeans, not so few non-Singaporeans, who came out of deep respect and a sense of compulsion that here was a man they wanted to do honor to. Many more wrote heartfelt messages and took part in tribute ceremonies at community sites all over the island. Thousands of overseas Singaporeans gathered in our embassies and consulates to remember Mr. Lee. And later in this funeral service, all of us in this hall, across our island, and in far-flung lands will observe a minute of silence, say the national pledge, and sing Majulah Singapura together. We have all lost a father. We grieve as one people, one nation. But in our grief, we've displayed the best of Singapore. Ordinary people going to great lengths to distribute refreshments and umbrellas to the crowd and help one another in the queue late into the night. Citizen soldiers, home team officers, cleaners, all working tirelessly round the clock. Our shared sorrow has brought us together and made us stronger and more resolute. We come together not only to mourn, we come together also to rejoice in Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's long and full life and what he has achieved with us, his people, in Singapore. We come together to pledge ourselves to continue building this exceptional country. Let us shape this island nation into one of the great cities in the world, reflecting the ideals he stood for, realizing the dreams he inspired, and worthy of the people who have made Singapore a home and nation. Thank you, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. May you rest in peace.
President will now deliver his eulogy.
Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong and the family of the late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, Excellencies, distinguished guests, friends and fellow Singaporeans. On behalf of all Singaporeans, my wife Mary and I convey our deepest condolences to Prime Minister Lee and the family of the late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew on Mr. Lee's passing. Today, Singapore bids farewell to our country's first Prime Minister, the founder of our modern republic. As a nation, we mourn a man who made a difference, a man who shaped our very identity as a society, a man who was devoted to ensuring that Singapore succeeded where no one thought we could. But we do not mourn alone. Mr. Lee's impact stretched far beyond our shores. He raised the profile of our republic, earning respect and admiration around the world. On behalf of Singapore, I thank the many friends of Mr. Lee, friends of Singapore, who have traveled great distances to be with us today. 2 years ago, I asked to visit Mr. Lee to see how he was doing. With Mr. Lee's increasing frailty and out of respect, I planned to meet him at his office. Mr. Lee, however, was adamant that he should come to my office. It took him a great deal of effort, but he did it as a mark of respect for the office of the President. This incident was more than a matter of protocol. To me, it demonstrated Mr. Lee's strong regard for our Constitution, for the institutions of our state. And even though he played a lead role in creating these institutions, he also knew that they had to be greater than any one man. It is often said that Singaporeans are a pragmatic people, and we are, but we are also fundamentally a nation built on ideals. Mr. Lee once said, "Each generation is fired by its own vision of the ideal society in the ideal world. The ideal can never be achieved, but because men have ideals, those societies progress." Mr. Lee's ideals were clear. He believed in them and he lived them. Meritocracy, honesty, integrity. When Mr. Lee became Prime Minister in 1959, he pulled together a strong team of leaders from diverse backgrounds. He ensured that positions in government were filled by the most capable people rather than those with connections or money. Mr. Lee took severe measures to curb corruption, a root cause of inequality. He put in place tough laws to investigate those suspected of corruption and heavy penalties for those caught taking bribes. By ensuring that our government and economy stayed honest, accountable, and free of corruption, Mr. Lee assured investors and companies that Singapore was the right place for their investments. Companies from around the world came and continue to come to Singapore, creating opportunities for employment, learning, and growth for Singaporeans. Mr. Lee demanded, without compromise, complete integrity in personal and professional matters from himself, his family, and his colleagues. He said in Parliament in 1979, "The moment key leaders are less than incorruptible, less than stern in demanding high standards, from that moment, the structure of administrative integrity will weaken and eventually crumble." To make sure that our public services were working well to serve the people, he made unannounced visits to inspect our HDB estates, hospitals, parks, and other public places. Integrity, however, was more than the basis for a strong economy and a capable government. Mr. Lee had a vision of Singapore as a fair and a just society. Today, all Singaporeans have the opportunity to contribute to and benefit from Singapore's development, regardless of race or religion, connections, or family background. Through his personal example, Mr. Lee embedded a sense of integrity into our very identity as a nation. With integrity as our nation's bedrock, Mr. Lee forged a cohesive society that shares common values and experiences across races and religions. When Singapore gained independence, we were a fractured and divided society. This past week, Singaporeans from all walks of life came together to mourn the loss of Mr. Lee. Large numbers of Singaporeans queued patiently for hours to pay their last respects at Parliament House and community tribute sites across the island. Many individuals and businesses offered shelter and refreshments to those who had been waiting in line, lending a helping hand to fellow Singaporeans. This would have made Mr. Lee very proud. This was what he had worked for his whole life: to build a united people who respect and care for one another as fellow citizens. Every National Day, we look forward to seeing Mr. Lee. I remember vividly our National Day parade 2 years ago. There had been some uncertainty about Mr. Lee's health. While I was waiting to enter the floating platform to officiate the parade, suddenly I heard a huge roar, a cheer, the biggest that day. My staff informed me that Mr. Lee had just made his entrance to take his seat. That roar captured the feelings of a nation, of all of us towards Mr. Lee. It rang with respect, affection, friendship, and deep emotional attachment. It is not something that can be easily put into words, but I know that all Singaporeans in their hearts understand what I'm talking about. It was the sound of one nation united. We will miss Mr. Lee at this year's National Day parade. But he will be foremost in our minds and in our hearts. Over the past week, we have mourned the passing of a man and an era. There will never be another Lee Kuan Yew. No one person can take his place nor do what he did. But Mr. Lee believed passionately that Singapore had to be greater than any single individual. When Mr. Lee stepped down as Prime Minister a quarter of a century ago, he was still in good health. He had many more years to contribute. But he knew that Singapore would always be a work in progress, that each generation needs its own leaders. Now is the time for us to take up the torch, to further the ideals upon which Singapore was built, and to make them our own. There is a well-known saying, most famously used by Isaac Newton, and I quote, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants," unquote. We are held aloft by Mr. Lee and our founding generation. They have given us the foundation, the ability, and a confidence to look forward to the future, to shape an even better Singapore for all Singaporeans. Together, we can respond to challenges. Together, we can create new opportunities for our children and grandchildren in Singapore. This is Mr. Lee's legacy for us. We must continue to pursue our ideals with courage and commitment. And so, I call on all Singaporeans to honor the memory of Mr. Lee by working together to achieve happiness, prosperity, and progress for our Singapore. This will be our tribute to Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. Goodbye, Mr. Lee. May your soul rest in peace.
The Emeritus Senior Minister will now deliver his eulogy.
Mr. President, family members of the late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, friends. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew gave his life to us. To truly appreciate this, you had to have marched alongside him in his long political journey, or study him closely, his words and actions, his ideas and vision, his values and philosophy, or carried along by his passion in building a nation and improving the lives of Singaporeans, or lived his worries day in and day out. To Singaporeans, he was our first Prime Minister, our leader who fought for our independence, the man who turned Singapore from third world to first, our national father. For me, he would always be my teacher. I first met Mr. Lee in 1958 when I went to his office to invite him to speak to my school. He was the leader of the opposition. Later, I nervously chaired the talk to a packed hall. That was my high point in school. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew was Singapore, but it surprised me that he had earned that accolade just 2 years after Singapore's independence. On a field trip with my class of international students to Puerto Rico in 1967, a Puerto Rican excitedly shouted, "Chino, Chino," when they saw me. I shouted back, "Singapore." He replied, "Lee Kuan Yew." Mr. Lee drove his people hard because he had to toughen fledgling Singapore quickly. As he put it, he had to account for the lives of millions of Singaporeans. He rallied and united a disparate population to share a common identity. He braved necessary long-term painful policies. Farmers were resettled and land acquired. Old malls and temples made way for public housing, roads and schools. Gangsters and drug traffickers were detained without trial. Some people alleged that these policies lacked compassion. But Mr. Lee taught people how to fish and brought fish to Singapore waters. He housed and schooled millions. He gave us safe streets and parks. He was a leader, not a populist politician. The outpouring of grief, gratitude, and love for him says it all. People know that Mr. Lee did immense good for them. Mr. Lee consulted widely with colleagues and people he trusted. He told his backbenchers to bring out the people's concerns and gossip from the coffee shops and the hawker centers. Mr. Lee never muzzled anyone, but he robustly defended his convictions and Singapore's interests, very often to the discomfort of his critics. To those he believed were out to destroy Singapore, he put on his knuckle dusters. Mr. Lee was a good teacher. He was always scanning the future, anticipating challenges, preempting problems, and thinking out solutions. He shared with the cabinet useful articles, his conversations with world leaders, and insights from overseas trips. He studied best practices and explored innovative ideas for Singapore. Where there were no precedents, he thought out creative and innovative solutions. Mr. Lee was a worrier. He worried incessantly whether Singapore would survive after he and the old guard were gone. He wanted to be judged on this, not by the city he had built and the lives he had improved, as Singapore prospered and hard times and history forgotten, he did not believe that able, committed, and honest leaders would emerge naturally, unlike his generation, who were born with fire in their bellies to fight for independence, multiracial equality, and a fair and just society. And so Mr. Lee single-mindedly planned for leadership succession. He emphasized character, motivation, commitment, and ability over academic grades. He underlined the importance of having the moral authority to govern. In pushing for leadership renewal, he had to cut short the political careers of his old colleagues. This was painful for him. He said that it was emotionally difficult but necessary. I had to do it, whatever my own feelings. I know he felt for them. He would occasionally ask me about them. Learning from Mr. Lee, I too planned for leadership renewal. He was surprised when, soon after the 2001 general election, I intimated my intention to step down. He told me that there was no hurry. I explained that Deputy Prime Minister Hsien Loong was already approaching 50. I wanted to give him a long runway to lead Singapore and develop the fourth-generation leadership. After I took over as Prime Minister, Mr. Lee was punctilious in observing the protocol of my office. He made sure he arrived before me for all events. As I respected him as my elder and mentor, I told him to dispense with this practice at non-formal events. But he explained that it was important to observe this protocol. Otherwise, people might draw the wrong conclusion that he did not respect me and take the cue from there. I valued Mr. Lee's advice when he was senior minister in my cabinet. He sought to understand my thinking and objectives and suggested refinements and sometimes alternatives to my policies and programs. But he always made it clear that the decision was mine to make. He was, as he put it, a resource and data bank. We lunched regularly. Our conversations never drifted far from his life's work. We shared many common concerns, including the emerging trend of income stratification and social fragmentation. He worried about almost every aspect of Singapore. He never ceased sharing, and I kept on learning. Once in a while, he showed his soft side. We talked about our families and health. After Mrs. Lee's death, I glimpsed how lonely and sad he was. Sadly, we had to discontinue our lunches in 2013 because of his health. Sadly, his physical health declined. Sadly, Mr. Lee is gone. I cannot put his legacy more eloquently than his old guard comrade, the late S. Rajaratnam. He wrote, "There is one monument which I think would bring warmth and comfort to him in the twilight years of his life. And that is a city and society which he, more than anybody else, has literally built out of nothing. The question today is not what Mr. Lee has done. What he has done is on record and indelible. But whether the city and society he has built will endure after he is gone, and how much of the past they will help shape the future will be remembered and understood by succeeding generations." Mr. Lee has completed his life journey. He transformed our lives. He touched our hearts. We grieve. But I believe Mr. Lee would say, what to do, this is life. He would want us to move on with the Singapore story. He would want us to fight our own battles and conquer our own peaks. He would want Singapore to succeed. Long after he's gone, we must honor him. I've seen and heard many acts of kindness over the past week. Singaporeans helping those who need help, staying strong together, even as we mourn. This shared, compassionate moment is the people's tribute to Mr. Lee. Let us stay united across race and language, religion, across young and old, across rich and poor, across our whole society, to write an exciting sequel to his and our Singapore story. Thank you, Mr. Lee.
Mr. Ong Pang Boon, member of the First Cabinet, will now deliver his eulogy.
The first time I heard of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew was during the 1952 postal workers' strike. When I was a student at the University of Malaya. At the time, the English and Chinese papers reported widely on how this legal advisor representing the unions argued successfully against the colonial government for the unions and workers' welfare. Like many other young people, I was deeply impressed by this brilliant lawyer. So when the PAP decided to contest the 1955 election, I did not hesitate to support the PAP as a volunteer and was assigned to be Mr. Lee's election agent. But after the election, my employer posted me to Kuala Lumpur, and I thought that was the end of my political involvement. In 1956, Mr. Lee was en route to the Cameron Highlands for a holiday with his wife and eldest son, and arranged to see me at the Kuala Lumpur Station Hotel. To my surprise, he asked me to join the PAP as its organizing secretary. I was determined to join the battle for independence from colonial rule and accepted his offer without a second thought and joined the March for Change. I have never regretted that decision. As the PAP's organizing secretary, I had to work closely with Secretary General Lee and other EXCO members. This gave me a better understanding of Mr. Lee. He was a consummate and far-sighted politician. Maximizing every opportunity to advance his political advantage and the PAP's interests. Although English educated, He understood that power rested with the pro-communist students from Chinese schools and the trade unions. Hence, he was always worried that the PAP could be hijacked by the pro-communists. We fought with the pro-communists several times in the early years, but we won because Mr. Lee had the strong support of like-minded comrades like Dr. To Ching Chai, Dr. Go King Sui, and S. Rajaratnam. In 1959, the PAP won the general election on the back of the Chinese-educated voters of Singapore. I joined the first PAP cabinet with Mr. Lee as Singapore's first Prime Minister. He was a dedicated Prime Minister with broad perspectives. During cabinet meetings, there would sometimes be differing views on certain issues. But after active discussion, he was able to accept alternative views and ideas. I served in the cabinet until 1984. What struck me most about Mr. Lee was his complete passion for Singapore. He spent every moment thinking of how he could improve Singapore and Singaporeans' lives. Once he decided that a certain policy was in the interest of his beloved Singapore, he would implement it, even if it meant making himself unpopular. There were critics who disagreed with Mr. Lee's policies. But I believe the man should be measured on the following considerations. First, everything Mr. Lee did was to make Singapore better. He could be forceful towards his political opponents and those who disagreed with him. But throughout his life, he was always wholeheartedly fighting for the best interest of this small and vulnerable nation. Second, without Mr. Lee, the Singapore story would be quite different. He was the lightning rod that galvanized the pioneer group of PAP leaders and grassroots supporters in our battles, first against colonial rule and then the pro-communists and communalists. In short, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew was a far-sighted leader who had the courage to realize his vision. Without him, Singapore would not be what it is today.
Mr. S. Dhanabalan, former cabinet minister, will now deliver his eulogy.
As one who worked closely with Mr. Lee Kuan Yew for a period, I want to focus on just 4 aspects of his leadership that remain with me. First, he had an absolute obsession to ensure an honest, corruption-free political process and public administration system. He had seen the damage a nation and society suffer when well-meaning leaders allow those close to them to take advantage of their position. Mr. Lee demanded and expected honesty and probity from political colleagues, from his equivalent of the Long March comrades, public servants, and from all members of his family. He was seen as a hard-hearted man who acted without feelings. But on the few occasions he discussed privately with me the decision to act against someone, I know that he agonized over the decision. He was convinced that a soft-hearted approach would undermine the ethos he wanted to embed deeply in public service. The second point is how he planned succession. What is still vivid in my mind is the time and mental energy he spent to prepare us for the responsibilities ahead. Much of the time in cabinet meetings was spent with him sharing his experience in politics, in policy making, and policy implementation. He circulated and discussed critically essays and commentaries from journals, and newspapers. When he made official visits and went to conferences, he always made it a point to take a few of us in the younger team along with him, to familiarize us with how to interact with the leaders of other nations and observe how to probe, get a better understanding of global events. He would always try to seek the relevance to Singapore of his as well as our observations. We were deeply sensitized to looking at everything in terms of what we could do in and for Singapore, or equally important, what we should avoid doing. Mr. Lee never tired of repeating his war stories, observations, and conclusions about events and personalities. To me, he was minister mentor from the time I started working with him. The third point is the way he took decisions. The myth is that he brooked no opposition to what he wanted and that the cabinet members merely fell in line. That was not my experience. He argued tirelessly to get cabinet to accept his views, not because it was the PM's view, but because of the strength of his arguments. I think he felt he had failed were he not able to convince his cabinet colleagues. When he spoke as Prime Minister at important occasions, he sent drafts of his speeches to his colleagues for views and suggestions before he settled the final version. The idea that he expected his team to follow him like a herd of sheep without question completely misrepresents the man and his values. The last point concerns his reputation as the complete political pragmatist who did not allow idealism to get in the way of what would work in and for Singapore. He was a pragmatist, yet in a very deep sense, he was an idealist. He was obsessed with not only what would work in Singapore, but what the feel and timbre of our society should be. This is well illustrated by his approach to the language policy. In a population comprising 75% Chinese, the easiest way to ensure political support and electoral support would have been to champion Chinese language and behind that, Chinese chauvinism. He was convinced that for our nation to be distinct and different from other nations, we had to be multilingual, with English as the main language of administration and commerce. But each racial group must maintain its cultural identity with the mother tongue as a second language. To convert Chinese schools into national-type schools and push for Mandarin against Chinese dialects were the acts of an idealist, not the acts of a pragmatist. Today, come to say our farewell to Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, who is in a complete sense the father of all Singapore that we know. Up to the very end, he was committed to this nation. In the words of Tennyson, though made weak by time and fate, he remained strong in will, determined not to rust unburnished, but to shine in use. Farewell, sir.
Mr. Sidek bin Saniff, former Senior Minister of State, will now deliver his eulogy.
Saya terkejut apabila Encik Lee Kuan
When
Yew
Mr. Lee
meminta saya
asked me to
bertanding
stand as a candidate
sebagai calon dalam pilihan umum
in the
pilihan raya umum pada tahun
1976 general elections, I was surprised.
Keputusan saya menerima
My decision to
tawaran
accept
beliau
his offer
untuk bertanding
to stand
sebagai seorang calon PAP
as a PAP candidate
telah memberikan satu kejutan
created quite a
kepada
stir
masyarakat Melayu.
in the Malay community.
Ini hanya beberapa tahun sebelum itu
Just a few years earlier,
saya telah memberi pandangan-pandangan
I had
yang
expressed differing views
berbeza daripada pemerintah
from the government
mengenai pendidikan.
about education.
Deputi yang terhormat, beliau adalah seorang ketua yang tegas,
He was a tough taskmaster,
tetapi banyak memberi nasihat.
but always full of advice.
Beliau mengingatkan supaya jangan sekali
Never waffle,
berdolak-dalik,
he would say.
bersikap terbuka,
Be open,
sentiasa waspada,
be attentive,
tegas.
firm,
Tetapi yang paling penting,
but above all,
mestilah bersopan santun.
be polite.
Nasihatnya ialah supaya kita tumpukan
His
perhatian
advice
kepada
was to
pendidikan.
concentrate on education.
Ini akan memastikan anak-anak kita
This would
menjadi
ensure
pengamanah
our
negara
children
yang
would
lebih
go
boleh
on
dipercayai
to become trustworthy
apabila
trustees
mereka
of
dewasa.
our nation when they grow up.
Saya amat berterima kasih
I am most grateful
Encik Lee
to Mr. Lee
kerana telah memberi sokongan padu
for fully
kepada
supporting
penubuhan Yayasan Mendaki.
the formation of the Mendaki
Pada
Foundation.
tahun 1979,
In 1979,
apabila saya dikendaki menemani
when I was to
Konsul
accompany Hsien,
Menteri Kewangan pada waktu itu
then Minister of
ke
Finance,
China,
to China,
Encik Lee bertanya saya,
Mr. Lee
sama ada saya
asked
boleh
me
tahan cuaca sejuk.
if I could take the cold Chinese winter.
Beliau juga bertanya, adakah Anda
Do you
mempunyai
have
kot musim
an
sejuk?
overcoat?
Saya berkata,
He asked.
yang saya akan
I said
membelinya.
that I would buy one.
Beliau menjawab, jangan buang duit.
No, don't waste money, he replied. Don't waste money.
Selepas berhenti sejenak,
After
Beliau
pausing, he said,
amat mata
Ahmad Mata
kot musim sejuk,
has a
yang bagus.
good overcoat.
Pinjamlah daripadanya.
Borrow from him.
Bagaimana pula dengan
What
boot
about
untuk
boots
menyarung kasut
to
semasa
cover
berjalan?
your shoes for walking?
Saya memberitahunya,
I
tidak
said
ada,
I didn't have any,
tapi akan membelinya.
but I would buy a pair.
Jangan buang duit.
No, don't waste money.
Dia berhenti sejenak,
He paused,
pinjam daripada Chok Tong.
borrow from Chok Tong.
Jadi saya ke negeri China
So off I went to China
dengan kot musim sejuk
with a
dan sepatang
borrowed
sepasang
overcoat
boot.
and a borrowed pair of boots.
Encik Lee berpegang teguh kepada sikap
Mr. Lee
berhemat
believed
cermat,
in frugality,
baik dalam kehidupan
both in his
kepribadiannya
personal life as well
maupun di peringkat
as
nasional.
nationally.
Dan beliau mengamalkan pegangan
And
beliau
he
itu.
walked the talk.
Peristiwa tadi
The
adalah
episode
satu contoh
is an example
dan juga menunjukkan sikap
and also showed his
kebapakannya,
fatherly character.
sikap kekayaan. Sikap kebapaannya
And his
dan
fatherly
sikap
character
amat teliti.
and sharp eye for detail.
Bercakap tentang sikap berkhidmat.
Speaking of not being
Encik
wasteful,
Lee tidak suka membuang masa.
Mr. Lee disliked
Beliau
wasting
bukanlah
time.
orang yang suka berlengah.
He was not one to procrastinate.
Pada tahun 2010, apabila saya
In
menghantar
2010,
senaskah buku saya
when I presented him with a copy of my book
ucapan
of
yang
speeches
dan rencana bertajuk
and news
The
articles
Singapore
entitled
Malay Paradigm,
The Singapore Malay
ataupun dalam bahasa
Paradigm,
Melayunya, Paradigma Melayu Singapura. Beliau mengucapkan selamat
he
maju
sent me a
jaya
personal
kepada
note
saya
of best wishes.
melalui satu nota pribadinya beberapa hari
A
kemudian.
few days later,
Saya tersentuh
I felt touched
dengan jawapan luhur beliau
by his gesture
dan memberitahu bahawa
and
buku
replied
tersebut
that the book
tidak akan menjadi kenyataan
would not have been
tanpa
possible
pandangan jauh. Encik Lee.
but for Mr. Lee's foresight.
Beliau terus membalas pada hari yang
He
sama
responded on that very day itself
dengan tulisannya sendiri.
with his own handwriting.
Lantas berkata kepada saya,
He said,
terima kasih Sidek.
"Thank you, Sidek.
Saya telah berpeluang menemani beliau
I
ke
had
luar negara.
several opportunities to accompany him
Semasa
abroad
beliau berkunjung ke Israel dan
when he
Jordan
traveled to Israel
pada
and
tahun
Jordan
1995.
in
Saya
1995.
merupakan salah seorang anggota rombongan
I
Singapura.
was on the Singapore
Kedua-dua
delegation.
pemimpin, Perdana Menteri Israel Yitzhak
Israeli
Rabin
Prime Minister Yitzhak
dan Raja
Rabin
Hussein dari Jordan
and Jordan's King Hussein
meraihkan kami
both
sebagai
entertained us
tetamu di kediaman
in their
mereka.
respective homes.
Ini adalah satu contoh klasik
This was a classic
layanan baik
example
orang-orang Yahudi.
of Jewish and Arab hospitality.
Penghargaan yang dan penghormatan yang
Utmost
tertinggi
appreciation
diberikan kepada Perdana Menteri
and respect being bestowed on our former Prime Minister,
Salut emas.
a respect tinted in gold.
Saudara-saudari setanah air.
Fellow
Hari ini
Singaporeans,
kita merakamkan setinggi-tinggi
today
penghormatan
we register our
dan
deepest
dan
respect
penghargaan
and appreciation
kepada seorang tokoh
to this
berwibawa ini.
great man.
Encik Lee memiliki ciri-ciri
Mr. Lee
dan ketokohan
was the embodiment
seorang negarawan.
of the term statesman,
Seorang yang hadir di kalangan kita
someone who
hanya
comes
sekali
along once
dalam beberapa
every few decades
untuk meninggalkan kesan mendalam
to make an indelible
terhadap
mark
masyarakat dan di seluruh
on society
persada
and the world at large.
kepada keluarga beliau.
To his family,
Negara turut berkongsi
the nation
kesedihan
shares your sorrow
dan kepiluan yang Anda rasakan.
that you feel.
Salam takziah yang amat mendalam.
Please accept our heartfelt condolences.
Saya harap kepiluan Anda
May you
sekeluarga
be consoled
sedikit sebanyak terubat apabila mengenal
in the
hakikat
knowledge
bahwa tokoh pengasas
that our founding
negara
father,
yaitu bapa Anda,
your father,
sebenarnya telah menikmati
had lived
kehidupan dan hayat panjang
a long and
yang lagi bermakna.
meaningful life.
Rakyat Singapura
Singaporeans
berhutang budi
are
kepada beliau.
indeed indebted to
Izinkan
him.
saya membacakan serangkap
Let me
pantun
recite a Malay
Melayu
pantun
yang menghargai
or short poem.
nilai budi seseorang. Pisang emas di bawah
This Malay
belaya,
quatrain
masak sebiji
means
di
that
atas
monetary debts can be paid
hutang
off,
emas boleh
but
dibayar,
debts of good deeds
hutang budi
cannot be
dibawa
repaid.
Pun pepatah Melayu pula berkata,
A person brings such debts to his
harimau
grave.
mati
There is also a Malay
meninggalkan
saying,
belang.
which
Manusia
means
mati
that a person who has done
meninggalkan
many great deeds will always be remembered.
Encik Lee,
Mr. Lee,
kami ingin menegaskan
we would like to assure you
bahawa rahsia warisan yang Anda tinggalkan
that your legacy
akan diteruskan.
remains intact.
Kami akan selalu
We shall always
menghargai
cherish
nasihat Anda,
your advice,
terutama sekali
especially
dalam memerintah
in
negara.
governing.
Anda pernah berkata jika
You said
Anda
if you
ingin
want to
menjadi
be
sepanjang
popular
masa,
all the
setiap
time,
masa, Anda akan silap memerintah.
you will misgovern.
Said he, if you want to be popular all the time, you will misgovern. Dan Anda sering menggesa kami
And you always
untuk
urged
mengambil
us
pendekatan yang pragmatik.
to be pragmatic.
Dan yang paling utama,
And above all,
Anda tegas meminta
you
kami
insisted
agar sentiasa
we
jujur
remain
dan
honest and clean.
bersih. Dua sifat yang mempunyai lantunan
Two characters
pengertian yang kental.
that has deep, solid meaning. PM, SM, MM.
Selamat berpisah.
Farewell.
Selamat berpisah.
Farewell, my friend.
Selamat berpisah.
Farewell.
Mr. G. Mutu Kumarasamy, trade unionist, will now deliver his eulogy.
சிங்கப்பூர் முன்னாள் பிரதமர் திரு லீ குவான் யூவை பற்றி
சிங்கப்பூரின் முன்னாள்
சில வரிகளை அவரை பற்றி
A few words about Singapore's former Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew,
நன்றி தெரிவிச்சுக்கிறேன்.
thank you for the opportunity given to me to say a few words.
அவர் சிறந்த தலைவர் மட்டும் அல்ல.
There is so much to talk about Mr.
ஒரு
Lee.
தந்தையும் கூட. எனக்கு
Not only an outstanding human being, but an outstanding father as far as I know. When I first saw him, I was very proud.
இன்றைக்கு நான் இங்க நின்னு
Today,
ஒரு
I'm standing here
மட்டும் இல்லாம ஒரு தொழிலாளர்
not only as a laborer,
இன்னைக்கு இங்க நின்னு
but
பேசுறேன்.
a trade unionist leader.
அவரை தான் சேரும்.
That glory
நான் சிறு
is
வயதில்
credited to him.
என்
When
தகப்பனார்
I was
எப்பவுமே
young,
சொல்லுவாரு,
my father would
அவர்னால
often
தான்
tell
இன்னைக்கு
me
நம்ம
about Mr. Lee.
இந்தியாக்காரங்க குடும்பம் தலை தூக்கி இருக்கு.
Because of him,
இல்லைன்னா
our Indian
இன்றைக்கு அவங்க
community has
யாருமே
progressed.
சொந்தத்துல நிக்க
If not,
மாட்டாங்க.
none of
ஏன்னா
them
அந்த
would stand on
காலத்துல
their own feet.
இந்தியாக்கார சமுதாயம்லாம் எனக்கு
Because
தெரிஞ்சாப்புல
during those
எங்க
days,
தகப்பனார் சொல்வாரு,
my
அதாவது
father used to say
பெண்களை வேலைக்கு
that
அனுப்ப
most
மாட்டாங்க.
Indian families will not
ஆண்மகன் தான்
allow
வேலை
their women to
செய்யணும்னு ஒரு
work.
கலாச்சார கட்டுப்பாடு எங்களுக்குள்ளார.
There was a cultural
அதனால
boundary
எல்லாருமே
limiting only
ஆண்மகன்
men
தான்
to
வேலை
work.
செய்வாங்க. அந்த மாதிரி வேலை செய்யும்போது சிங்கப்பூர்ல ஒரு
As
காலகட்டத்துல
such,
அந்த குடும்பத்துல ரொம்ப கஷ்டமா இருந்துச்சு.
it was very difficult for those families. Some children had to stop their studies halfway. How to manage the families in such a situation with single incomes, low income? Mr. Lee knew about this well. Upon knowing this, he wanted to pave a pathway for the Indian community. He announced, he asked Indian women to join the workforce and gave the assurance
துறையை உருவாக்கி வச்சிருந்தார். ஏன்னா ராத்திரில பெண்கள் வேலை செஞ்சுட்டு வந்தா பாதுகாப்பா இருக்கணும். அப்படிப்பட்ட
he wanted to protect the women who come home from work late in the night.
அப்பதான் அவர் சொன்னாரு, கணவனும் மனைவியும் வேலை செய்தா
Also, he announced the housing plans encouraging people to allow women to work so that housing became affordable. Such fundamentals were formulated and many Indian women started going to work. That's why they are able to stand on their own feet. I am proud of it. If he didn't do that, then this would not have happened today. It's a big thing. It's a big glory. My father used to say this to me. After some time, after I finished my education, I went to work. I was an apprentice wireman at PWD. Many people told me, guess what they said? Our Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, is a person who gets angry very often. If he dislikes, he will fire someone. I was not bothered about it. I kept on doing my work. Once they brought me to work at Changi Cottage Holiday Bungalow. When we got there, we serviced the air conditioning system. We didn't know who is coming to stay in that bungalow. We went there because there was work to do. When I was servicing the aircon in that room, I suddenly saw Mr. Lee Kuan Yew enter the room. He gazed upon us. How will you feel? Previously, they warned us that he was a person who gets angry very often. We were scared. We couldn't do anything. Even then, we controlled our minds. We climbed down the ladder. He asked us, Have you finished the work? Yes, sir. Where is your supervisor? Outside. Bring him in. We brought him in. He told my supervisor, I asked you to do the job, not him. Now do it in front of me. He was actually doing it. We were confused. We were worried that we had not done the job correctly. When we kept quiet, my reporting officer told me that he will tell me the meaning later. When everything was completed, Mr. Lee finished in one sentence. From now, I must not see you in Istana. I must not see you in Changi Holiday Bungalow. Look at how who will get this strictness? Only my father who has passed on, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. Till now, I think of him, of what my father said about him. We must live with a principle like him, a duty, commitment like him. His philosophy and principle doesn't disappear at any point of time. Only because he formulated things as such then, we are well off today. Also, he was a good father for all the unions. In one of his May Day speeches, he urged that employers must be such and employees must be such and the government must be such. All three forces must work in one way. You must sit down, discuss and implement. He taught us in detail. Who will teach us like that? Apart from teaching us the details, on that May Day speech, he urged the low-income workers to come forward and there are a lot of causes for them to come forward and learn and progress. He asked them to upgrade their skills. Many low-income workers, upon hearing his advice, did so. They became technicians, they became engineers, they learned handcraft skills. I was one of them, and I'm proud of that. If he didn't do that day, we wouldn't have progressed today. All this glory goes to him, and I pray for that. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, I pray to God for your soul to rest in peace.
Mr. Leong Chun Lun, Tanjong Pagar community leader, will now deliver his eulogy.
Mr. President, family members of the late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, friends, today we mourn the loss of the country's first Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. I've been a grassroots leader in Tanjong Pagar constituency for 39 years. I'm privileged to be able to stand here today to pay tribute to Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. I consider him my leader and my friend. His departure not only is a loss for the country, but also a deep personal loss for myself. Having worked closely with him for so many years, I have developed a profound respect and admiration of Mr. Lee. I now wish to share with you some stories of my encounters with him, with this great man throughout these years. Back in the early days, in Chinese New Year celebration would kick off with lighting of firecrackers and follow with singing of the national anthem. And at a particular case, when the firecrackers has been lit, but they never go off. Getting a bit impatient, the MC decided to carry on and play the national anthem. But the moment that started, the firecracker went off loudly. So it sounded very funny at that time, but Mr. Lee was not amused at all. He told us later that if we can't even do these things right, how do we run the country? The incident showed us how serious he was about all things concerning Singapore and how he always expected us to do our best. Mr. Lee cared for his people. As at a Tanjong Pagar Family Day function, we had set up a stage for the day's activities. The key officials were sitting on the stage, and the residents were sitting in front of the stage. The place was hot and sunny. Mr. Lee noticed that the residents are perspiring. And he turned around and asked, "What are we going to do about it now?" He was always thinking about the people, and he expected us to put all the interests, our interests above, should not put our interests above the residents. At constituency dinner, Mr. Lee liked to sit with grassroots leaders so that he could talk to them. We have always been arranging the sitting such that his old friends would be seated en route to his table. It would take him some time to get to his table, as he would stop by to speak to every familiar faces. When Mr. Lee heard that the old friends were doing well, his face would light up with pride. Even though Mr. Lee is no longer with us, his legacy is something that we Singaporeans will always remember.
Ms. Cassandra Chew, former journalist, will now deliver her eulogy.
I didn't know Mr. Lee Kuan Yew personally for most of my life. We met while I was on 2 assignments as a journalist, documenting his life at home and collecting photographs for a picture book for his 90th birthday. I met him up close 6 times for meetings and interviews from July 2011. Most were large formal meetings at the Istana, and naturally, I was on my best behavior. After all, this was the man who had led Singapore to independence, triumphed over his opponents in a storied political career spanning over 60 years, and transformed a sleepy colonial outpost into a bustling metropolis. And there he was, in person. I didn't dare say a word to him until my editor made me lead one of the interviews. He thought Mr. Lee would enjoy the interaction with a younger Singaporean. I was so nervous I could hear my heart pounding before the meeting and actually felt a headache coming on. I braced myself to be peppered with questions on whether I was married, when I planned to have children, or whether I spoke Mandarin often enough. Questions Mr. Lee, as you know, was known to ask young Singaporeans he met. But there was none of that during the 80-minute interview, which was focused on the beginnings of his political career. There was no room for nervousness either. He came in, sat down and asked, "Who's going to start?" And with that, the interview began. As always, Mr. Lee was focused on the task at hand. Over time, I gained more glimpses of what he was like as a person. For instance, it was a thrill for me to learn from his oral history that he once failed an art exam in primary school. But that was, of course, a small blemish on his distinguished academic record. I also learned that in his later years, he craved his late mother's gado-gado and mee siam, which, thankfully, his sister, Madam Monica Lee, could replicate. I made at least 8 visits to 38 Oxley Road, where I went into all the rooms. But the only time I saw him at home was during our 20-minute photo shoot, which began in his study, where he spent most of his time while at home. He was in good spirits that day, dressed in a white short-sleeved shirt, dark trousers, and his trademark sport shoes. It looked as if he had been going through his email at his desk, which also had newspapers, magazines, binders of papers, and stationery, all neatly arranged. It was clear that even at home, his focus was on his work. It didn't matter to him that his furniture was more than 60 years old and outdated. They served their purpose, and that was all that mattered. That was how he lived his life, very simply and frugally, and always putting the country first and his own creature comforts second. We moved to the living room, which was also a very private space, because it was where the late Mrs. Lee was remembered. Her photographs were displayed in 2 rows above her urn, and I was told Mr. Lee would gaze at them daily as he had his meals. I could feel how much Mr. Lee missed his late wife. She was his partner, his anchor, for more than 63 years. The last set of photos we took at his home are my favorite. Seated on a chair by a wooden table on the veranda, Mr. Lee flashed a bright smile. They turned out to be the best photos on the reel. No one knows about this, but to thank him for the photo shoot that day, I had prepared 2 chocolate cupcakes after learning how much he enjoyed chocolate. I even got the bakery to label each cupcake so he'd know exactly what kind of chocolate cupcake it was. But on the day, I was far too excited and dropped the box before I could present them to Mr. Lee. I had been reflecting on what I was learning about Mr. Lee as a person and founder of independent Singapore, and had just begun to understand just how much he and his family had sacrificed to ensure Singapore's success. I realized how much I had taken for granted and how much more I had to thank him for. To me, Mr. Lee had transformed from an elderly statesman who our textbooks say did a lot for us, but didn't quite seem relevant to my daily life, to a man for whom I developed a deep sense of gratitude and appreciation. So much of Singapore began to make sense to me now that I had seen the world through his eyes. I decided to try to express my thanks again and wrote him a thank you card. I had so much to say, but didn't know how to say it, and ended up writing 4 simple lines. A few weeks later, I received a reply. True to his personality, his response was brief and to the point. Thank you, he wrote, and signed off as LKY. I was thrilled to have heard back from him, but a little sad that I didn't convey what I felt in my heart. This is my last chance. Mr. Lee, thank you for everything. Some days, I cannot believe how fortunate I am to have been born a Singaporean. We don't have everything, but we have more than most because of your lifelong labor. On behalf of young Singaporeans everywhere, I'd like to say thank you.
Mr. Hsien will now deliver his eulogy for the family.
Mr. President, Prime Minister, and members of the Cabinet, distinguished guests here to honor my father, my fellow Singaporeans, and friends of Singapore. Singapore has lost the father to our nation. For my family, we have lost our beloved father and grandfather. We are bereft. I was born in 1957, And for as long as I can remember, Papa was a public figure. As a child, I was only vaguely aware that my father was an orang besar, or VIP in Malay. All little children must think their fathers are special. I do not remember when it dawned on me that he was not just my own special father and not just an ordinary orang besar. He was an extraordinary orang besar. Papa was immersed in his work for much of my childhood. In September 1998, he gave Fern and me our copy of his book, The Singapore Story. In it, he penned a note with a tinge of regret. To Young and Fern, while I was running around, as I described in this book. You grew up while I was running around, as I described in this book. Perhaps in different circumstances, he would have been a very successful businessman or an entrepreneur, but he chose to dedicate his life and to serve the people of Singapore and to build a better future for all. He wanted to ensure his 3 children had a normal childhood. He didn't want us to grow up with a sense of privilege and entitlement. As a teenager in secondary school, seeking to assert my independence, I would sometimes ride the public bus. Papa did not object, and my poor security officer had to follow me around the buses. When I was in junior college and keen on outdoor activities, my security officer had to shadow me as I trekked around Pulau Ubin, Pulau Tekong, and canoed around Singapore. But Papa's principles ensured that I had as normal a childhood as possible. And although I think I put out the security detail often. Family holidays were happy occasions. We were able to see more of Papa. We didn't go anywhere far away, posh, or exotic. The government rest houses in Fraser's Hill, Cameron Highlands, and later Changi Cottage, a small 2-bedroom seaside bungalow that holds many precious memories for me. Even if once in a while the aircon there doesn't work and we have to call out for help. Golf was Papa's principal recreation and a passion. So golf featured prominently not only on vacations, but also after work in the evenings. The 9-hole course in the Istana grounds provided ample room for us children to find adventure whilst he golfed. Both Loong and I were sent for golf lessons. We learned to hit a long drive from the tee box, but neither of us really took to the game, and we stopped when we grew up. But eventually, Papa too, prompted by Ling, gave up golf. And for exercise, he took to jogging, swimming, stationary cycling, as well as walking. He had read of the benefits of aerobic exercise. He had examined and accepted the evidence, and he had changed his old habits. Papa was like that, firm in his convictions, but open-minded enough to accept fresh evidence and to change, even to sacrifice something he loved and enjoyed, like golf. Like with much else that he had set his mind to do, Papa remained disciplined and exercised regularly, even to the last. In January 1973, when I was 15, Ling and I joined Papa and Mama on a trip to visit Loong, who was at university in Cambridge. It was our first family holiday where we traveled so far away. On that trip, Papa and Mama took the family to Stratford-upon-Avon, Shakespeare's birthplace. We watched the Royal Shakespeare Company's production of Coriolanus and toured the usual Shakespearean sites at Stratford. I had assumed that it was just Mama indulging her love for Shakespeare and trying to educate us whilst we were on vacation. But years later, when Papa wrote his memoirs, we realized the hidden meaning this visit held for my parents. They had married secretly in Stratford-upon-Avon in December 1947. When Fern and I married in 1981, Papa was keen to have us live with them at Oxley Road. Mama, perhaps because of her own difficulties living with in-laws as a new bride, and my wife Fern too had reservations. So upon marriage, Fern and I made a home of our own. When my brother Loong's first wife, Ming Yang, died in late 1982, leaving Loong with two very young children, the family felt the weight of the tragedy. Fern and I wanted to help the family hold together and create some happy occasions to continue to share. Although growing up, all our birthdays, including those of Papa and Mama, remained unmarked and uncelebrated, we began inviting the family to our home for Papa's and Mama's respective birthdays, for which I would cook a simple meal. At that time, the family included my father's father, Kong, Papa and Mama, Ling, Loong and his two children. Papa loved a good steak, and he had a Peranakan sweet tooth for desserts. Over time, the group grew larger. The grandchildren had views of their own, and they could be outspoken. They were often ready to engage with Papa on issues of the day. I recall one birthday dinner where Hsien Wu debated with his yeye till late, long after we had finished dinner, both sides wanting to ensure that the other understood his perspective and point of view. Whilst there have been public celebrations to mark my father's key birthdays, these small, private family celebrations were a source of much joy to him and Mama. It was anticipated for months before and savored in the memory for months after, and was part of the ritual of each passing year. The arrival of grandchildren was also a source of great joy for Papa and Mama. Mama was traditional enough that she was thrilled that I had one son after another. But Papa, my sense is that Papa would have been equally delighted if Fen and I had had 3 daughters. When the grandchildren were little, Papa would love to have them playing around him as he exercised after work in the evenings. At weekends, he often took them out to the zoo, the bird park, the science center, and other places where families would go. Our youngest son, Shao, arrived long after all the other grandchildren, and long after they had given up hope of any more grandchildren. Papa was in his 70s and less active in public life, so he and Mama took this as a wonderful opportunity to enjoy their last grandchild. Many know how privileged Singaporeans are to have benefited from my father's contributions to building our nation. I know that growing up as his son, I've also been privileged to have witnessed what it means to be a good man, a good husband, a good father, and grandfather. To Singapore and Singaporeans, Papa was at various times PM, SM, MM. But whatever his office, he was actually always LKY. Even after he stopped being MM, people found it awkward to refer to him by anything other than this alphabet soup. But to his grandchildren, he was always Ye. And to Fern and me, he was and will always be Papa. We will miss him dearly. This past week, my family and I have received a deluge of messages expressing appreciation for my father's life, sometimes providing poignant memories of interactions with Papa. And although in life, Papa kept the two threads of public and private life apart and shielded Mama and the children from the glare of the media, in his passing, the two threads come together as we share the grief of loss. We have been overwhelmed by the outpouring of grief and affection. We have been touched beyond words by the many Singaporeans who have braved the elements to pay their last respect at all hours of the night and day. Young and old, on foot or aided by walking sticks, in pushchairs or wheelchairs, you came to pay your last respects, to sign condolence books and to write messages. You posted touching tributes and poems online and waited patiently to greet his cortege as it passed. Please accept my family's inadequate but deep and heartfelt thanks. We know our loss is your loss too, and that the loss is deep and keenly felt. We are humbled that so many have come forward to demonstrate your affection for, respect of, and gratitude to my extraordinary father. A father we share with Singapore. Farewell, Papa.
The Prime Minister will now lay a wreath on behalf of the family. The President will now lay a wreath on behalf of the state. Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the last toast, followed by the observance of a minute of silence to pay our last respect to the late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew.
We'll now recite the National Pledge together.
We, the citizens of Singapore, pledge ourselves as one united people, regardless of race, language, or religion, to build a democratic society based on justice and equality, so as to achieve happiness, prosperity, and progress for our nation.
Please be seated.
This marks the end of the state funeral service. Mr. Lee's cortege will leave for Mandai Crematorium for the private funeral service. With this, we end Media Corp's live coverage.